The morning Delia Reed walked into Hartwell's general store with a fistful of coins she knew were no good. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against her thighs just to keep anyone from noticing. It was the spring of 1883, and the town of Colton's Crossing, Texas sat low in a shallow valley between two tired ridgelines where the scrub oak grew stubborn and the creek ran brown half the year. It was not a beautiful town. It was the kind of place that had grown out of necessity rather than ambition. A collection of sun-bleached buildings pressed together along a single main road that turned to mud when it rained and cracked like old leather when it did not. There was a livery at the north end, a church with a leaning steeple at the south, and in between the usual assortment of saloons, a barber shop, a doctor's office that doubled as a dentist's, and Hartwell's general store, which smelled of dried tobacco, coffee beans, and the particular sharp tang of freshly milled flour. Delia had ridden in from the east, from the 40-acre parcel she had inherited 7 months ago when her husband, Thomas Reed, had died of a fever that moved through him faster than a grass fire in August. Thomas had been a quiet man, steady and unremarkable, and she had not loved him the way women in novels loved men, but she had respected him and relied on him, and his absence had left a hole in the daily structure of her life that was devastatingly practical. He had known how to repair the windmill. He had known when to plant and when to wait. He had kept the books and negotiated with the merchants in town, and Delia had managed the household and the kitchen garden and the mending and the cooking, and together they had made something that functioned like a future. Now she had the land and a debt that was growing like a weed she could not get to the root of, and she had 1 season left to prove that the farm could sustain her before the bank in Abilene started asking questions she did not have answers for. She needed seed. Winter wheat seed, enough to plant the back 40 before the soil got too dry, and she needed it this week. She had counted what money she had left, real money, and it had not been enough. Then her neighbor, a jowly man named Burkett who leered at her every time she rode past his fence line, had offered to loan her money at terms she recognized as extortion, and she had refused him. Then she had sat at her kitchen table for 2 nights running and looked at the coins she had found tucked inside a tin behind the loose board in the pantry, coins she had discovered only last month, and she had let herself believe that maybe they were just old, maybe they were just worn, maybe she was wrong about what she suspected they were. She was not wrong. She knew it standing in front of Hartwell's counter, watching old Gerald Hartwell turn one of the coins over in his thick fingers. He was a heavy-set man with a white mustache that drooped at the corners and small, sharp eyes that missed very little. He pressed the coin between his thumb and forefinger, then tapped it lightly against the counter, and the sound it made was wrong, too flat, too soft, the sound of base metal pretending to be something it was not. Delia felt the blood drain from her face. She had 11 of those coins, enough she had calculated at home by lamplight to make up the difference on 2 bushels of winter wheat seed. She had not planned to pass counterfeit money through malice. She had not planned anything at all except desperation, and she was standing there now realizing that desperation did not excuse what she had done, that Gerald Hartwell had a right to be angry, that she might be in very serious trouble. The other customers in the store had not noticed yet. There were 2 women near the dry goods shelves and a rancher in a canvas duster examining harness buckles near the door. But Hartwell's expression was shifting from confusion toward something harder, and Delia felt her throat close up entirely. Then a voice came from somewhere behind her, low and even, the kind of voice that did not raise itself because it did not need to. "Gerald, I believe I owe you for those fence staples from last week. Let me settle that while you help the lady." Delia turned. The man who had spoken was leaning against the shelving unit that held the tins of lamp oil, arms folded across his chest, watching Hartwell with a calm that seemed almost deliberate. He was tall, lean in the way of men who worked rather than men who simply did not eat, with dark hair pushed back under a weather-beaten hat the color of old saddle leather. His face was angular, jaw strong, with a few days of dark stubble that was not quite a beard and not quite negligence. His eyes, when they moved from Hartwell to her, were the color of creek water over slate, a quiet gray-green that looked at her not with pity but with a kind of careful steadiness. He pushed off the shelving and walked to the counter, setting down a leather coin purse that landed with a solid, honest weight. He reached inside and counted out silver dollars, real silver dollars, placing them one at a time on the worn wood of the counter while keeping his eyes on Hartwell's face and not on Delia's coins at all. "For the staples and for the lady's seed order," he said. "I believe she was getting 2 bushels of winter wheat." Delia opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Hartwell looked at the silver on the counter, then at the man, then at Delia. Something moved across the old merchant's face that might have been relief, or might have been the calculation of a man who had seen enough of other people's hard times to know when not to ask questions. He swept Delia's coins off the counter with one broad hand and tucked them into his vest pocket without another word. 2 bushels, Hartwell said, already turning toward the back room. "Give me a few minutes." The man beside her pulled his coin purse back, cinched it closed, and tucked it into his jacket pocket with the same unhurried efficiency. Then he looked at her, and she realized she was still standing with her mouth slightly open. "You don't have to say anything," he said quietly. "Have to say something," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected, which surprised her. "What you just did was a business transaction," he said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he cut her off, like he was trying to spare her the embarrassment of the explanation. "Gerald and I square up every few weeks. It's nothing unusual." "That's not true," she said. He looked at her. A faint line appeared at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but something in that direction. "No," he agreed, "it's not." His name was Lionel Barker, and she would not learn it for another 20 minutes, when he carried both bushels of seed out to her wagon because she had been too proud to ask, and he had simply picked them up and walked out the door. She followed him because what else was she going to do, and when he set the sacks in the wagon bed with a practiced ease and straightened up, she made herself look at him directly. "I'll pay you back," she said. He studied her. "I didn't do it expecting repayment." "I didn't ask what you expected," she said. "I said I'd pay you back." Something shifted in his expression then, something like genuine interest rather than mere courtesy. "All right," he said. "I'm Lionel Barker. I run the Barker spread about 6 miles north of here past the Cedar Breaks." "Delia Reed," she said. "I have the 40 acres east of town, the one with the windmill that sounds like it's arguing with itself." That got her something closer to an actual smile. "I've heard that windmill," he said. "Thought it was a gate hinge gone bad." "I've been meaning to fix it," she said, and then she did not know why she said the next thing except that it came out before she could stop it. "My husband was better at the mechanical things." The word husband landed between them and sat there. She watched Lionel's face and saw him absorb it without flinching or redirecting. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, and he said it the way men said it when they actually meant it rather than just filling silence. 7 months ago," she said. "Fever." He nodded. "I lost my father 3 years ago. It changes the shape of things." She looked at him. He was not looking at her with sympathy exactly, more with the recognition of someone who knew what it was to take over a piece of land that was simultaneously a legacy and an anchor. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly it. It changes the shape of things." She climbed up onto the wagon bench and took the reins and looked down at him, standing in the road below her. The spring sun was high enough by now to make the dust on his hat visible, and there was a smear of something that might have been axle grease on the back of his left hand. 6 miles north," she said, "past the Cedar Breaks." "That's right," he said. "I'll bring the money by," she said. "Give me 2 weeks, when the planting's done." She did not wait for him to respond. She clicked her tongue at the horse and turned the wagon east and did not look back, though she was aware for a longer time than made sense that she could still hear the particular quiet of the town behind her, and somewhere in that quiet, the sound of a man watching a wagon drive away. The 40 acres were harder than she remembered them being when Thomas was alive, though she knew this was not logical since the land had not changed. only her relationship to the labor it demanded. The backfield was cracked and gray from the winter, and she spent 3 days with the plow and the old gray mare she called Patience, working the earth up into soft brown furrows that smelled of wet clay and promise. She planted the wheat herself, walking the rows with a tin bucket of seed, and the methodical care of someone who understood that each seed represented a decision made in desperation that she now had to honor with diligence. Her nearest neighbor to the east was a widow woman named Mee Croft, who was 70 years old and had outlived 2 husbands and 3 horses, and had opinions about everything. Mee came over the second morning of planting with a jar of preserved peaches and a commentary on Delia's plowing technique that was thorough enough to constitute a lecture. "You're not sowing deep enough on the western edge," Mee said, standing at the field's edge with her arms crossed, squinting at the furrows. "I know," Delia said. "The clay there runs shallow. Thomas always planted the western edge first, while the soil was still soft from mourning," Mee said. "Thomas is dead," Delia said, not unkindly. Mee was quiet for a moment. "He is," she agreed. "Plant the western edge early tomorrow, trust me." She did, and Mee was right, and she spent the rest of the week watching the field with the vigilance of someone who had put everything into it. She thought about the coins a great deal. She did not know where Thomas had gotten them. She suspected she would never know. The tin had held 11 coins and nothing else. No note, no explanation, just those flat-sounding pieces of metal that looked right and were wrong in every way that mattered. She thought about Lionel Barker too, though she was more careful with those thoughts, filing them under the practical heading of a debt owed rather than anything more complicated. She remembered the way he had walked to the counter without any apparent hesitation, as if covering a stranger's bill was something a person simply did when the situation required it. She remembered his voice, level and quiet. She remembered that he had not looked at her with condescension, had not made her feel small, had simply acted and then had the grace to pretend it was nothing unusual. On the 8th day after planting, the windmill broke down entirely. It did not simply stick or slow. It made a grinding shriek in the early morning that brought her out of the house in her work boots and her nightgown with her hair down. And then it went silent, and when she climbed the ladder and inspected the gearbox, she found that the main drive shaft had cracked clean through. She came down the ladder and sat on the bottom rung for a while, because the windmill pumped water from the well to the stock tank and to the garden, and without it, she was hauling water by bucket, which she could do for a day or two but not indefinitely, and the wheat seedlings were going to need water once they pushed up through the soil. She thought about who she could ask. She thought about Mee Croft, who was 70 and had bad knees and could not climb a windmill ladder. She thought about Burkett and the kind of price he would put on his help, and she dismissed the thought with a force that surprised her. She thought about Lionel Barker, 6 miles north past the cedar breaks. She told herself she was going to repay his money. She had been going to ride out there in another week anyway. She was not asking for a favor. She was asking if he knew someone who could fix a drive shaft, which was a reasonable practical inquiry between neighbors, nothing more. She dressed and braided her hair and saddled Patience and rode north. The cedar breaks were a dense mile of scraggly cedar trees that grew along the lip of a limestone escarpment, where the land lifted before dropping again into a shallow draw. She followed the road through them and came out the other side into country that was different from hers in a way she felt rather than saw immediately. Her land was flat and earnest and a little tired-looking. The Barker spread had the quality of a place that had been tended with intention over time. The fence lines were straight, the posts solid, the wire tight. The grass in the pastures had been managed, not overgrazed. There were Hereford cattle scattered across the far field, red-brown and white-faced, maybe 60 head, which was a respectable number for the country. The ranch house itself was a low, wide structure of limestone block with a covered porch running along the front, and a stand of live oak trees on the south side that would shade the house through the hottest part of summer afternoons. She reined Patience in at the gate and called out, "Because that was what you did." And a moment later Lionel Barker came around the side of the house with a hammer in his hand and what appeared to be sawdust on his forearm. He stopped when he saw her. He was wearing a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and he squinted at her against the late morning sun. "Mrs. Reed," he said. "My windmill broke," she said. "The drive shaft cracked. I was wondering if you knew someone who could fix it." He came to the gate and opened it without ceremony, and she rode Patience through and stepped down from the saddle. Up close in the daylight of his yard, she could see that he was somewhere in his mid-30s, maybe 34 or 35, with the weathered look of a man who spent most of his waking hours outside, and there was something alert in his expression, a quality of attention, as if he was genuinely listening to what she said rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. "Drive shaft on a windmill needs to be replaced, not repaired," he said. "You need a new one fitted. Where did it crack?" She told him, and he nodded and set the hammer down on the top rail of the fence and wiped his forearm on his trousers. "I've done that repair before. I have a spare shaft in the barn that might fit depending on the make. What kind of wheel is it?" "I don't know," she said. "It's old. Thomas bought it second hand." "I can ride out and take a look," he said, and then added, as if forestalling any argument she might make, "I'm not busy this afternoon." She looked at him. "You don't have to, I'm aware," he said. He looked faintly amused. "Do you want the windmill fixed or not?" She pressed her lips together. "Yes," she said. "I want the windmill fixed." He smiled then, a real one this time, and it changed his face considerably, made him look younger, more open, like a window that had been stuck shut and was finally letting in air. He went to the barn to collect what he needed, and she waited in the yard and looked around at the quiet order of the place and felt something she could not quite name, something between envy and admiration. He brought a length of iron shaft wrapped in burlap and a canvas bag of tools, and he tied it all behind his saddle on a long-legged sorrel horse he called Gus without explanation. They rode back south through the cedar breaks with the spring sun behind them and the wind moving through the cedar trees with a sound like breathing, and they talked as they rode because it would have been strange not to, and because once Lionel Barker started talking, in that unhurried way of his, it turned out he was worth listening to. He had inherited the ranch from his father, he told her, 4 years ago. He'd been running cattle for 12 years before that, working other men's spreads from South Texas up into the Panhandle, learning what to do and, more importantly, what not to do, before his father's health had declined enough that he'd come home to Colton's Crossing. "Do you have family nearby?" she asked. "A sister in San Antonio," he said. "She married a man who sells hardware, which is about as far from ranching as a person can get without leaving Texas. We write letters. She's happy." He said it without bitterness, with something that sounded like genuine pleasure in his sister's happiness. "What about you?" "My family is in Missouri," Delia said. "My mother and 2 brothers. My mother thinks I should come home. She doesn't understand why I'd stay on a piece of land in Texas when I could come back to St. Joseph." "Why do you stay?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment, watching the road ahead. "Because it's mine," she said. "The land is mine. I have never owned anything that was actually mine before. The farm in Missouri was my father's and then my brother's. This land is in my name. I'm not leaving it." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That makes a great deal of sense to me." She glanced at him and found him looking at the road ahead with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something adjacent to respect. The windmill was not as complicated as she had feared, which he told her was fortunate because, if the crack had traveled another inch, it would have taken the gear assembly with it. He climbed the ladder with the burlap-wrapped shaft on his shoulder and spent an hour and a half up there in the spring wind while she stood below and handed up tools when he called for them. And she did not look away, not because she was watching him specifically, but because it would have been foolish to stand beneath a man on a 30-foot ladder and not pay attention to what was happening. When he came down, the windmill was turning again. A clean sound now, no grinding, just the easy rotation of veins in the wind and the steady rhythm of the pump rod moving up and down. She could hear the water beginning to fill the stock tank, a sound that was one of the most reassuring sounds she had ever heard. She looked at the windmill and then at him and did not trust herself to say what the restoration of that sound meant to her, so instead she said, "Come inside and I'll make coffee." The inside of the house was clean and plain and told the story of two people who had lived there, one of whom was gone. There were still Thomas's boots by the door because she had not quite been able to make herself move them. There were his shelves of almanacs, though Delia had begun making her own notes in the margins. There was a worn quilt on the back of the kitchen chair that had been his mother's, which Delia had not touched. But there was also evidence of Delia herself, the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, the small painting of a Missouri River scene she had brought from home, the careful arrangement of her kitchen that reflected her own logic rather than Thomas's. Lionel sat at the kitchen table and accepted the coffee she set in front of him, and she sat across from him with her own cup, and they talked for another hour without either of them seeming to notice that they were doing it. He told her about the drought of 1880 and how he had almost lost the herd, and she told him about her kitchen garden and how she was trying to expand it to include a cash crop of something Thomas had always resisted. He told her that his father had resisted everything new as a matter of principle, and she laughed, genuinely, for what felt like the first time in a long while, and the sound of it surprised her so much that she put her hand over her mouth. He was watching her when she looked up, and there was something warm in his expression that was careful enough not to be alarming. "You should do that more," he said. She lowered her hand. "Do what?" "Laugh," he said simply, and then looked at his coffee cup as if he had not said anything remarkable at all. She thought about that on the 3 nights that followed, lying in the dark with the sound of the windmill turning outside and the wheat seedlings pushing up through the soil in the back field in some private and miraculous process she could not see but had to trust. She thought about how it was ridiculous to read anything into a man who had been kind twice, because that was apparently the kind of man he was, and how loneliness could make a person assign significance to ordinary courtesy. She also thought about the debt. She had the money now, or most of it, saved from the household account she had been managing with a care that would have impressed the most frugal of New England housewives. She counted it out on a Saturday morning, tucked it into an envelope, and rode north through the cedar breaks for the second time. He was in the corral working with a young horse that had not yet made peace with the saddle, and he was doing it with the kind of patience that was not passivity, but rather a long, confident steadiness, moving with the horse rather than against it. She stopped Patience at the fence and watched for a few minutes without calling out because it seemed wrong to interrupt something that was going well. When he finally saw her, he said something quiet to the horse and walked it to the fence post and tied the lead loosely and came to where she stood. She held the envelope out to him. "What I owe you," she said, "for the seed. I know it doesn't include the windmill," but he took the envelope and then he held it back out to her. "Keep it," he said. She looked at the envelope and then at him. "No," she said. "Delia," he said, and the use of her first name, entirely natural, unceremonious, stopped her in a way she had not expected. "You needed the seed. You've planted the field. When it comes in, you'll be fine. Keep the money." "I will not keep the money," she said. "I didn't ask for charity and I don't intend to accept it." He studied her for a long moment and she could see him deciding something. Then he said, "All right, then I have a proposition." She waited. "I need someone who can keep books," he said. "Proper ledger work, accounts receivable from the sale of cattle, accounts owed on supplies and equipment. My father kept everything in his head, and when he died, I spent 6 months trying to untangle what he owed and who owed him. I've been keeping my own records since, but I'm not good at it, and I know it. 3 hours one morning a week." She looked at him. "You're offering me work." "I'm offering you a trade," he said, "for whatever you feel you owe me, which I still say is nothing, and then a fair wage after that if you want to continue." She thought about it for longer than she needed to, because she was trying to determine if the offer was genuine or if it was something else wearing the clothes of practicality. What she concluded, looking at his steady face and the open way he held himself, was that it was genuine. He was not a man who said one thing and meant another. She had known him only a few weeks, but she had the strong impression that he did not know how. 3 hours on Friday mornings, she said. I'll need to see the current state of the books before I agree to the wage. Fair, he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted. They're bad, I'll warn you now. How bad? I once listed a purchase of barbed wire under miscellaneous expenses because I couldn't remember the supplier's name. She closed her eyes briefly. All right, she said. I'll see you Friday. The books were, as he had warned her, not good. Not fraudulent or dishonest. Simply the record of a man who was exceptionally capable at the practical and physical work of ranching, and less capable at the administrative machinery that kept a ranch financially viable. She sat at the table in what he called the office, which was a corner of the main room separated from the rest by a low bookshelf, and spent the first 2 Fridays simply organizing what existed before she could begin to make it functional. He left her to it mostly, moving in and out of the house with various ranch business, occasionally appearing in the office doorway to answer questions she had written down in a list so as not to interrupt him repeatedly. He brought her coffee without being asked, and once a plate of cornbread that he had apparently made himself, which she ate without comment and which was, she noted privately, quite good. On the 3rd Friday she found a discrepancy in the cattle sale records from the previous autumn. She went to find him. He was in the barn mending a saddle, the leather draped across his knees, the all moving with practiced efficiency. You were shortchanged by $32 on the October cattle sale, she said. He looked up. The Crawford sale, if that's the man who bought 42 head, yes. He set the all down. You're sure? I did the arithmetic 3 times, she said. The price per head you agreed to was $2.18 more per head than what was actually deposited. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see the particular quality of stillness that came over him when he was processing something that required more than a practical response. Hal Crawford, he said. He's been buying cattle from this ranch for 6 years. That doesn't mean he counted right, she said. She paused. Or that he counted wrong by accident. He looked at her steadily. No, he said, it doesn't. The situation with Crawford resolved itself 3 weeks later when Lionel rode to Crawford's place with the ledger figures, and a civil, direct conversation that she was not present for, but that he described to her afterward, with a flatness that suggested it had been unpleasant. Crawford had claimed it was an error. He had made up the difference. Whether it had been deliberate or not she never knew, and Lionel did not seem to want to speculate. But he told her that the $32 was sitting on the table in the office for her, an additional payment on top of her agreed wage. You earned that, he said. It's your money, she said. It existed because you found it, he said. Take it. She took it. She tucked it into the household account and kept her face composed. The Fridays became something she looked forward to in a way that she examined carefully, and tried not to examine too much. She rode through the cedar breaks in the early morning when the light was still low and golden, and the cedar trees smelled sharp and clean, and she arrived at the Barker spread to find it always the same kind of quiet industry she found there on every visit. There was always coffee. There was always some question he had written down for her on a scrap of paper in his spare, clear handwriting. There were always moments during the morning when he came and stood in the office doorway, and they talked about things that were not entirely about accounts, about the cattle market, about the weather, about what was happening in the territory. He told her once in early summer that he had heard there was talk of a new railroad spur being pushed through the country to the north of Colton's Crossing, which would change everything about how cattle were moved to market. She told him that Meecroft had said the same thing and did not believe it. Meecroft is usually right, he said. She is, Delia agreed. She told me to plant the western edge of my field early, and she was right about that too. How's the wheat coming? He asked. Better than I expected, she said, and she tried not to let her voice carry the full weight of what that meant, which was that the wheat coming in well meant she was going to be all right, which was not a small thing. He seemed to hear it anyway because he said, "Good," quietly, with a particular emphasis that felt like understanding rather than just acknowledgement. The wheat came in during late June, earlier than she had hoped and better than she had let herself plan for, and she stood in the back field on the morning. She harvested the first real yield, and felt something move through her that was not quite grief, and not quite joy, but was perhaps the particular emotion that belongs to the moment when a person realizes they are going to survive something they were not sure they would survive. Croft came over that afternoon and they sat on the porch and drank lemonade, and said nothing for a long time, which from Croft was the highest possible compliment. She told Lionel about the harvest the following Friday and watched his face when she said the numbers, the actual bushels per acre, and he set his coffee cup down and looked at her with something that was openly pleased. "That's an excellent yield for this soil," he said. "I know," she said. "I planted the western edge early." He laughed, and she realized she had been angling for exactly that laugh without quite admitting it to herself, and the realization arrived with a small, warm, uncomfortable weight in her chest. It was Croft, inevitably, who made her say it out loud. Came over in early July with a jar of wild honey and the particular expression of a woman who had something to say and had decided to say it regardless of whether it was wanted. She sat at Delia's kitchen table and arranged herself and said, "You've been riding north every Friday morning for 2 months." "I keep the books for Lionel Barker," Delia said, setting cups out. Said me. Delia sat down. "What does that mean?" "It means what it means," said. "He's a good man, you know. His father was difficult, had a difficult reputation, but Lionel's always been different. Quiet, decent, doesn't run his mouth." "I'm aware he's decent," Delia said carefully. "He hasn't courted anyone in years," said. "People in town have wondered about it, but I think he just hasn't found anyone worth the effort of it." Delia looked at her cup. "I'm just telling you what I know," said with perfect innocence. Delia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, because it came out before she could reasonably prevent it, "I feel guilty sometimes." Looked at her. "About Thomas." She stopped. She started again. "I'm not sure I know what I feel exactly. I like Thomas. I was fond of him. But when I talk to Lionel Barker, I feel something that I never quite felt with Thomas, and I don't know if that's grief playing tricks or something real, and I don't know if it matters either way because he's never said anything to suggest." "Delia," said. "He rode 6 miles to fix your windmill." Delia looked at her. "And he paid for your seed without flinching and without asking for anything back," said. "And you told me he brings you coffee every Friday morning." She set her cup down with the particular authority of a woman who had been paying attention to more than anyone realized. Men like that don't do those things for women they find unremarkable. Delia sat with that for the rest of the day and into the next morning, and she did not know what to do with it except ride to Colton's Crossing on Saturday to sell a portion of her wheat yield to the grain buyer who had come up from San Angelo. And while she was in town, she stopped by Hartwell's for a few supplies and ran into Lionel Barker at the counter. This was not unusual. Colton's Crossing was not a large town, and both of them had regular business there. But this time he was standing with a man she did not know, a thick-necked man in a good coat who appeared to be making some kind of offer or proposition, and she could tell from 20 feet away that Lionel was not interested, though he was being civil about it. She collected her supplies and was waiting for Hartwell to wrap her coffee beans when the thick-necked man left and Lionel came to stand beside her. "Who was that?" she asked because she was curious and had decided that honesty was more efficient than pretense. "Land agent from Dallas," he said, "offering to buy the ranch. He's been through here 3 times now." She turned to look at him. "You're not considering it?" "No," he said with a flatness that closed the subject entirely. She looked at him for a moment. "Good," she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and the space between them in Hartwell's general store was charged with something she did not have a name for yet but recognized in the way you recognize a weather change before the sky actually shifts. Hartwell set her wrapped coffee on the counter. Neither of them moved for a moment. "I was going to ride back east," she said. "Are you heading back north?" "I am," he said. "Walk with me to the wagon," she said, because she was not yet ready for the conversation she could feel approaching, but she was not ready for him to leave either. He walked with her to the wagon and helped her load her supplies, which she would normally have done herself, and he did it with the ease of someone doing something ordinary rather than significant. When everything was loaded, she stood with her hand on the wagon board and looked at him. "Lionel," she said, "I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly." He met her eyes directly. "All right." "The morning in the store," she said, "when you paid for the seed, you didn't know me." "You had no reason to do that. Why did you?" He was quiet for a moment. The main road of Colton's Crossing moved around them, a wagon going past, two women crossing to the milliner's, a dog investigating the base of the water trough. Ordinary town sounds on an ordinary Saturday. "Because you needed it," he said, "and because you were trying very hard not to need it, and that seemed like the kind of thing that deserved some assistance." She looked at him. "That's not all of it," she said, because she was the kind of woman who pushed when she felt something was being held back. He looked at the road for a moment, then back at her. "No," he said, "I suppose it isn't." She waited. "You stood there like you were going to face whatever happened without flinching," he said. "Even though you were scared, I could see it, and I thought." He started again. "I thought that someone like that deserved to catch a break." She held that. "Someone like that," she said softly. "Someone with that kind of backbone," he said, and the word backbone in his mouth did not sound like a clinical description. It sounded like something he admired, the way you admire the quality of a fine piece of ironwork, appreciating both the form and the function. She swallowed. "Thank you," she said, "for the seed, for the windmill, for the books, which gave me something useful to do with my Fridays." "They've been useful for me too," he said. "I know," she said. "You were listing fence wire under miscellaneous." That got her the real smile again, and she climbed up onto the wagon bench while she still could, because if she stood on the ground in front of that smile any longer she was going to say something premature. She drove home through a July afternoon that was hot and still and golden, and she sat on her porch that evening and watched the wheat field ripple in the evening breeze. And she let herself feel what she had been carefully not feeling since the first Friday she had ridden through the cedar breaks, which was that she looked forward to seeing him with a specific quality of anticipation that had very little to do with ledger books. 2 Fridays later he met her at the gate and said without preamble, "My sister is coming from San Antonio. She'll be here at the end of the month." She swung down from Patience. "That's good news." "She wants to meet you," he said. She looked at him. "Why would she want to meet me?" He opened the gate for her and took Patience's reins and led the horse to the hitching rail without immediately answering, and she followed him and waited. "I write her letters," he said, securing the reins. "I may have mentioned you." She processed this. "How many times?" he considered. "Several." She looked at the yard, at the live oaks moving in the morning breeze, at the solid limestone walls of the house. "What did you tell her?" He turned to look at her, and there was a vulnerability in his expression that she had not seen there before, something unguarded underneath the steadiness. A man arriving at the edge of something he had been approaching slowly and deliberately for months. "That you're the most capable woman I've met in a long time," he said, "and that I find myself thinking about Friday mornings more than is strictly practical." The honesty of it hit her somewhere between her ribs and her throat. She stood in the summer morning on the dry grass of his yard and looked at him and did not say anything for a full 10 seconds, which for a woman who had opinions and was not shy about expressing them was an unusual kind of silence. "I find myself thinking about Friday mornings too," she said, "and about the cedar breaks, and about the way you explained the Crawford situation to me, and about other things that have nothing to do with accounting." He was very still. "Lionel," she said, "I was married before, and it wasn't a bad marriage, but it was a practical one, and I think I accepted that because I didn't know that something else was possible. I'm not sure I know it now either. I'm not sure what this is. I'm not asking you to be sure of anything, he said. I'm asking if I can call on you properly, take you to supper at the hotel in town, ride with you on something other than an errand. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. You can do all of those things. His sister Clara arrived at the end of July, and she was nothing like what Delia had imagined, which she admitted to herself had been a woman as quiet and measured as her brother. Clara Barker, now Clara Whitmore, was small and energetic and talked at a speed that made Delia's head spin pleasantly, and she had the same gray-green eyes as Lionel and the same directness. But where Lionel deployed it with patience and care, Clara simply aimed it straight at the nearest person and let it land where it would. She took one look at Delia when they were introduced at the Barker Ranch on a Sunday afternoon and said, "Good. You look like someone who can manage him." "I manage his books," Delia said. "I mean in the broader sense," Clara said. "He gets an idea in his head and keeps it there for so long it becomes part of the furniture. Someone has to occasionally point out that it's an idea and not a fact." Delia glanced at Lionel, who was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who had weathered many years of his sister's commentary and had arrived at a kind of peaceful acceptance. "She's not wrong," he said. Clara stayed 2 weeks, and by the time she left she and Delia had spent enough time together that Clara had told her things about Lionel's childhood and the difficulties of growing up with their father that made certain things about him make a great deal more sense. Their father had been a demanding man. She told Delia one afternoon when they were sitting on the ranch house porch while Lionel checked the south fence, a man who praised sparingly and criticized readily, who had expected Lionel to be capable and steady, and had not asked much about whether he was also happy. "He learned to be self-sufficient in a way that sometimes becomes its own wall," Clara said. "He's the most reliable person I've ever known, but it's sometimes hard to get him to say what he actually needs." Delia thought about that. "He said what he needed," she said. "To me, he asked if he could call on me." Clara looked at her with those gray-green eyes. "Did he?" she said, and then she smiled, a wide, delighted smile that had nothing of Lionel's careful restraint in it. "Well then," she said, "he must mean it. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." "I'm aware," Delia said. The courtship, such as it was, had the particular quality of two people who had been through enough of life to know what they wanted and were less interested in the performances and pretenses of it than in the substance. He came to supper at her farmhouse on a Tuesday evening in August and brought a good bottle of wine from the store in town, which told her he had thought about it beforehand. She made a meal that was simple and good, and she set the table properly, which she had not done for anyone since Thomas died. They sat across from each other in the lamplight of her kitchen and talked about everything and nothing, about the cattle market and the price of grain, about Clara's husband and the hardware business, about the almanac's prediction for the winter and whether they trusted it. She refilled his wine glass without being asked, and he thanked her without making it into something. And at some point in the late evening she realized that she had not once in the past 3 hours thought about what she should say next, had simply been saying what she meant, and that this was a quality she had not expected to find in another person's company. He left when the hour was decent, came to the door, held his hat in both hands in the lamplight from the doorway. "I had a fine evening," he said. "So did I," she said. He looked at her in the warm light for a moment. Then he said, "May I come back?" "You may," she said. He came back the following Tuesday, and then the Tuesday after that, and the Fridays continued as well, though she thought there was a different quality to the Friday mornings now, a slight alteration in the air between them that was not awkward but was alive in a way it had not quite been before. He still brought the coffee, and she still sat at the ledger books, and he still appeared in the doorway with questions, but sometimes the questions were not about the accounts. One Friday in September, when the heat had finally begun to break and the morning smelled of approaching autumn, he came and stood in the doorway and said, "My father's grave is on the south part of the property." I go there sometimes in the morning. I'm not sure why I'm telling you that. She looked up from the ledger. Maybe because you haven't told anyone before. He considered this. Maybe, he said. It was a complicated relationship. He was hard to please and not easy to love, but he gave me this land and that was not nothing. No, she said. It was not nothing. He looked at her for a moment. Do you visit Thomas's grave? It's on my property, she said. Under the oak tree on the east boundary. I go there on Sundays. I tell him how the farm is doing. She paused. I don't feel guilty about it anymore. Moving forward, I mean. He was very quiet. Good, he said, and the single word carried everything he meant by it without any further elaboration needed. On a Tuesday evening in mid-October, he arrived at her farmhouse looking slightly different than usual, and it took her a moment to identify what was different, which was that he was wearing what was clearly his good shirt, the dark wool one she had seen once before when he had attended a funeral in town, and he had shaved with particular care, and he had combed his hair, and there was about him the air of a man who had made a decision. She fed him supper and they talked as they always did, and after the meal she made coffee and they sat in the parlor rather than the kitchen, because the evening had gotten cool and she had lit the small fireplace. The fire was low and orange and the lamps were turned down, and outside the window the autumn dark was thick and comfortable. He set his coffee cup down on the side table. He looked at her across the lamplight. He said, "Delia, I want to marry you." She had known it was coming, she thought, in the way you can sometimes see a particular shape of cloud and know what kind of weather it will bring, not the exact moment but the direction. She had been thinking about it herself for weeks in the careful, practical way she thought about things, turning it over and examining it from all angles, considering what she wanted and why. But hearing it said out loud in his voice, in that direct and quiet way he had of saying things that mattered, made something happen in her chest that was distinctly not practical. It was warm and a little frightening and entirely welcome. "Tell me why," she said, because she was Delia Reed and she needed to hear it. He looked at her steadily. "Because you walked into Hartwell's store with your chin up and your hands shaking, and I thought you were the most honest person I'd seen in a long time. Because you planted your field in the right order and fixed your own fences and paid back every cent you felt you owed even when I didn't want you to. Because you found $32 in my books that I'd missed and gave me the knowledge without giving me a lecture about it. Because you make me want to be more careful about things and less careful about other things. Because Friday mornings are the best part of my week and Tuesday evenings are the second best, and I would rather not spend Wednesdays and Saturdays and all the other days without you in reasonable proximity." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted. Outside, the wind moved through the bare branches of the oak tree. "I want to marry you too," she said, "but I want to keep the East 40. He blinked and then he understood. "The land is yours," he said. "That was never a question." "It might become a question," she said, "if a husband has different ideas about Delia," he said. "The land is yours. The accounting work is yours. Any decision you make about the farm is yours. I have no interest in absorbing what you've built into something else. I want to be with you. The rest is logistics." She looked at him for another moment, and then she smiled, and she saw in his face the thing that always happened when she smiled, the small involuntary softening that told her more than any speech he could have given. "Yes," she said, "I'll marry you." They were married in November, in the church with the leaning steeple at the south end of Colton's Crossing, on a day that was cold and bright with a hard blue sky, and the smell of wood smoke coming from every chimney in town. Clara came from San Antonio with her husband, a pleasant, round-faced man named Henry who shook Lionel's hand with both of his, and said he was glad his brother-in-law had finally sorted himself out. Meecroft came in a black dress that she wore for every formal occasion regardless of its nature, and declared afterward that she had never doubted this outcome for a single moment, which Delia strongly suspected was a revision of history, but chose not to contest. Gerald Hartwell was there, because the whole town was essentially invited in the casual way of small Western communities, And when Delia saw him at the reception in the church hall, she thought for a moment about the morning in his store, the flat sound of those coins on the counter, the look on his face, and then she thought about what had followed from it. And she decided that there were some threads of life that were not accidents even when they felt like them. Lionel had arranged the ranch house for both of them, which had meant some practical conversations about furniture and habits, and the fact that she would be splitting her time between the farmhouse and the ranch, managing both properties across the 6 miles that separated them, which was unconventional, and which a few people in town had opinions about, though those opinions did not reach Delia in any form that required her to respond to them. She kept the East 40. She rode out there twice a week, and managed the planting rotation herself, and kept me Croft as a neighbor and confidant. She kept the books for the Barker spread, and had, by the 2nd year of their marriage, developed a system so organized that Lionel once said he thought their records were better than any ranch operation within 50 miles, which may or may not have been true, but which she accepted because it was probably close. The winter of their first year was hard, a cold that came down from the north in January and sat on the land like a judgment, freezing the water troughs and pushing the cattle into the ravines for shelter, and they worked side by side in those weeks, he on the ranch side, and she managing what could be managed on the farm side, riding patience through the cold with her breath making clouds in the frozen air. And they came together at the end of each day in the warmth of the ranch house, and were grateful for it in the specific way that people who understand difficulty are grateful for its absence. She told him about the coins in February, the full story, not just the bare facts that she supposed he had already pieced together. She told him about finding them in the tin, about the 2 nights at the kitchen table, about the decision she had made and what she had felt standing in Hartwell's store when the sound of that coin on the counter had told her everything. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When she was finished, he said, "You should have told me sooner." "I know," she said. "Not because it changes anything," he said, "because you've been carrying it. You didn't have to carry it alone." She looked at him across the kitchen table of their ranch house. "I'm not used to not carrying things alone," she said. "I know," he said. "You can get used to it." She thought about Thomas's tin of coins on the nights when she could not sleep, and she thought about Thomas himself with the fairness she always tried to bring to it. He had been a decent man who had managed his desperation differently than she had managed hers, who had hidden something he was ashamed of in the back of the pantry behind a loose board. She did not know the full story of those coins and never would. She chose to believe he had not intended her to use them. She chose to believe he had meant to deal with them himself, and that the fever had moved through him before he could. She visited his grave on the Sunday before spring planting every year, and she always told him how the farm was doing. And after the first year of her marriage, she started telling him about Lionel too, about the ranch and the cattle and the way Lionel had built new fence along the south boundary and was talking about adding to the herd. She did not think Thomas would have minded. She thought he would have been relieved that she was all right. In the spring of 1885, 2 years after the morning in Hartwell's store, Delia told Lionel she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen of the ranch house on a Tuesday morning, because it was a Tuesday morning and she had decided that waiting for a better moment was ridiculous. He was sitting at the table with his boots already on and his coffee half finished, ready to go out and see to the morning work, and she sat down across from him and said simply, "I'm going to have a baby." He looked at her. He set down his coffee cup with great care. He said nothing for long enough that she began to wonder, and then he got up from his chair and came around the table and knelt down beside her chair like he was going to propose something and put his hands over hers on the table. "Are you well?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, "more tired than usual, but fine." He looked at her hands under his for a moment. Then he looked up at her face, and what was in his expression was not complicated. It was simply joy, clear and unclouded, the expression of a man who had not allowed himself to want this very much until this moment when it became real. "Good," he said, which was a word he used for things that were far more than merely good. She put her hand on the side of his face for a moment, and he turned his face slightly toward her palm, and then she said, "You're going to be late for the morning work." "The morning work can wait," he said. "It absolutely cannot," she said. "Go. Come back for dinner, and we'll talk about everything." He went, though he looked back at the house from the yard in a way that made her smile at the kitchen window. Their son was born in October of 1885, a loud and healthy boy with Delia's dark hair and Lionel's gray-green eyes, and they named him William Thomas Barker, William for Lionel's father, because she thought it mattered to honor the complicated ones as well as the easy ones, and Thomas for the man whose land had started everything. Lionel held the boy in the lamplight of their room on the first night and looked at him with the particular expression of a man encountering something he has no adequate words for, and Delia watched from the bed, tired in a way that went all the way to her bones, and felt the strange, enormous completeness of it. Meecroft declared William to be a fine baby with excellent lungs and adequate hair for his age, which from me was practically a poem of praise. Clara came from San Antonio 2 weeks after the birth, and was so thoroughly delighted that she could barely be prevailed upon to put the baby down. She sat in the kitchen with Delia while William slept in the cradle in the corner and said, "I told Henry the minute I got Lionel's letter. I said they are going to be extraordinary parents." "You said that about me specifically?" Delia asked. "I said it about both of you, but I thought it about you specifically," Clara said, with the honesty that was apparently characteristic of the family in general. The farm on the East 40 continued to thrive. By 1886, Delia had expanded the cash crop section and was growing a mix of winter wheat and a small section of cotton, which she managed with a hired hand named Jonas, a quiet young man from Georgia who was good with soil and did what he was told without requiring management. The arrangement of her life was unusual by the standards of the territory, a married woman managing her own property separately from her husband's operation, but she had the benefit of not caring significantly what the territory thought, and she had the further benefit of Lionel, who had never once, in all the time she had known him, suggested that her way of doing things should be any different. He told her once in the second year of their marriage that watching her manage the farm was one of the things he admired most about her. She had looked at him sideways. "Most men would find it inconvenient," she said. "Most men are wrong about a great deal of things," he said. "I find it remarkable I told you that." "You said I had backbone," she reminded him. "I still think so," he said. "More so now." The seasons settled into a rhythm that was demanding and satisfying in roughly equal measure, the way life on the land tends to be. There were bad years, a dry summer in 1886 that scared her badly, and a late frost in 1887 that killed the first planting of winter wheat and forced her to replant at her own expense, a loss that stung in the specific way that agricultural setbacks sting. That combination of financial loss and the feeling of being outplanned by the weather. But the bad years were separated by years that were good enough to carry you through, and she had the books and the discipline and Lionel, who was the most practical and reliable source of support she had ever encountered. They talked about everything. This was the thing she had not known to expect, not from her experience of marriage, not from anything she had observed in the marriages around her. They talked about the cattle market and the price of cotton and the railroad question, which finally resolved itself in 1888 when the spur was indeed built through the country north of Colton's Crossing, changing everything about how cattle were shipped to market and vindicating Meecroft entirely. They talked about William's development and what he was showing interest in, which was, by the age of 2, everything, and by the age of 3, specifically anything mechanical. They talked about Lionel's father and Thomas, and the particular inheritances that the dead leave the living, both burdensome and useful. She told him once, in the quiet of an autumn evening when William was in bed and they were sitting on the porch of the ranch house with the stars coming out thick over the dark country, that she sometimes thought about the morning in Hartwell's store and wondered what would have happened if he had not been there. "I would have managed," she said. "I always manage. But I wouldn't have had the seed that season, and the field might have come in late or not at all, and everything might have gone differently." "You would have managed," he agreed. "You were always going to manage. I just made it slightly easier to do it in the right season." She looked at him beside her in the evening. "Why do you always do that?" "Do what?" "Minimize what you did," she said. "You do it consistently. You act and then you make the action sound like nothing." He considered this. "I suppose because I don't think the action deserves much weight," he said. "It seemed obvious in the moment. Someone needed something and I had it. That's not extraordinary." "It is when most people would have looked the other way," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," he said, "but looking the other way has never sat right with me." She took his hand in the dark of the porch. He turned his hand over under hers and held it properly, his thumb tracing the edge of her palm in the absent way he had when he was at ease. "I'm glad you didn't look the other way," she said. "So am I," he said. They sat in the dark and the quiet and the presence of all the things they had built, the ranch and the farm and the boy sleeping in the house behind them and the years already accumulated and the years still ahead. And it was not a small thing, and they both knew it. In the spring of 1889, Delia discovered she was expecting their second child, and this time she told him in the morning light of the kitchen with the coffee on, and William constructing something incomprehensible out of sticks at her feet. And Lionel's face did the same thing it had done the first time, that quiet, uncomplicated joy. And she thought she could probably spend the rest of her life producing that particular expression and count it time well spent. Their second child, born in December of 1889, was a girl they named Clara Mee, which settled both the question of the child's name and produced in Clara Whitmore, when she was informed by letter, a response so enthusiastic that her husband Henry wrote a separate letter saying he had never seen her that happy about any news in their entire marriage, which Clara disputed in her own subsequent letter. Mee Croft, when told that the baby bore her name in the middle position, said only, "It's about time someone showed some sense," and then knitted the child a blanket of a remarkable and impractical violet color that the baby wore out entirely before she was 2. Mee Croft died in the winter of 1890, peacefully in her own bed, at the age of 77, having outlasted 2 husbands, 3 horses, and most of the predictions anyone had ever made about her. Delia grieved her with the honest grief she brought to things, and she planted a stand of rosemary along the east fence of her farm the following spring because Mee had loved rosemary, and because it seemed right to put something in the ground. The 1890s arrived with a different quality of life than the 1880s had held. The railroad had changed the country the way Mee had always said it would, drawing more settlers, establishing a certainty about the future that the territory had previously lacked. Colton's Crossing grew, slowly, but with an inevitability that Delia watched with the particular attention of a woman who had been there before its growth and knew what it cost. New families came and new businesses opened, and the church got a new steeple that no longer leaned. And Gerald Hartwell retired and sold his store to a younger man who had opinions about organization that Hartwell had never entertained. William Barker, at 10 years old, was already helping with the cattle and had shown a particular aptitude for it, a natural calm with animals that Delia recognized as his father's quality at a younger age. He had questions about everything and expected answers, which exhausted some people and delighted Delia, who had always believed that questions deserved answers rather than deflection. Clara Mee was a different creature entirely, small and fierce and possessed of a will that her father said plainly, and without apology was exactly her mother's will in miniature. She was attached to the farm on the East 40 in a way that William was not, following Delia on her management visits with the seriousness of an apprentice, asking about planting schedules and soil quality with an attention that made Jonah's, the hired hand, say once that she was going to be a farmer before she was 12. She gets it from her mother, Lionel said, standing at the field's edge one afternoon watching Delia explain the difference between the western clay soil and the sandier eastern portion, to a 7-year-old Clara Mee, who was listening with her arms crossed and her small face arranged in the expression of concentrated engagement. She gets everything from her mother, Jonas said, except the eyes. Lionel looked at his daughter's gray-green eyes fixed on her mother's hands in the dirt and said nothing, because there was nothing to add to that. In the autumn of 1892, when William was 7 and Clara Mee was 2, and the ranch had grown to 112 head of Hereford cattle, and the East 40 had been expanded to 60 acres on the strength of a parcel Delia had purchased from a homesteader who had decided the territory was not what he had hoped. Lionel came home one Friday evening from town, with a look that she had learned over the years to recognize as the look of a man who had encountered something he needed time to sit with before he could fully speak it. She let him have supper first because she was practical, and she let William finish the story he was telling about the snake he had found in the south pasture, which was a long story with several digressions, and when William was finally in bed, she sat across from Lionel at the kitchen table with her hands around her coffee cup and waited. "Crawford came to see me today," he said. "Hal Crawford. The cattle buyer who had short-changed him by $32 9 years ago, who had made up the difference with a civility that might or might not have been genuine." "What did he want?" she asked. "He's going out of business," Lionel said. "He's selling out everything and moving to California. He wanted to let me know directly, and he wanted to return something." He reached into his jacket pocket and set a small folded piece of paper on the table between them. She looked at it but did not pick it up. "He says those $32 were taken on purpose," Lionel said. "He was in debt and he was cutting corners wherever he thought he could get away with it. He said he's been living with the regret of it for 9 years and he wanted to put it right before he left." She looked at the folded paper. "Is there anything in that?" "A banknote for $32, he said. She was quiet for a moment. "How do you feel about it?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I feel like a man who's glad he kept good books," he said, "because otherwise he'd have no proof it ever happened. And I feel like 9 years is a long time to carry something." She thought about Thomas's tin of coins. "Yes," she said, "it is. I told him I accepted it," he said. "I told him I hoped California suited him." "That was the right thing to say," she said. He looked at her across the table. "It was what you would have said," he said. She shook her head. "I might have asked more questions first," she said. He smiled. "I thought about asking more questions," he said. "But then I thought some things don't require more questions. They just need to be done." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held it, as he had held it that first evening on the porch and every time since, with that particular steadiness that had been the quality in him she had noticed first and come to rely on most completely. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not without difficulty, but with enough that was worthwhile to make the difficulty navigable. The cattle operation grew under Lionel's management to the point where he was selling regularly to buyers in Abilene and San Angelo, and the Barker name had the kind of reputation in those markets that came from consistent quality and honest dealing, which Delia had organized and documented in the ledgers, and which Lionel had built through years of careful work with the herd. The East 60 acres remained Delia's, entirely hers, and she managed it with an attention to diversification that the agricultural extension agent who came through Colton's Crossing in 1894 praised specifically, which she mentioned to Lionel that evening with more satisfaction than she allowed herself to show to the extension agent himself. "He said I was ahead of the thinking in the district," she told Lionel. "He's right," Lionel said. "He seemed surprised," she said. Lionel looked at her with the expression he had for this kind of thing, steady and slightly amused and entirely serious underneath. "His problem," he said. William, at 14, announced that he wanted to be a rancher, which surprised exactly no one. And Clara Mee at 11 announced that she wanted to manage her mother's farm someday, which surprised everyone except Delia, who simply said, "Then pay attention to the soil rotation schedule," and handed her daughter a copy of the planting ledger. In the long evenings of summer, when the work was done and the children were old enough to be reasonably self-sufficient for a few hours, Delia and Lionel sat on the porch of the ranch house and talked or were quiet, depending on what the evening wanted, and the stars came out over the Texas country with the generosity they always had, thick and indifferent and beautiful. Sometimes she thought about the morning in Hartwell's store and the woman she had been that day, frightened and stubborn and walking in with coins she knew were wrong because she could not think of what else to do. She did not think badly of that woman. She thought she had been a woman in an impossible position doing the best she could with what she had, and that sometimes life arranged itself so that the best you can do still puts you in a room where you are ashamed of yourself, and that what happens after that moment matters more than the moment itself. What happened after that moment in her case was Lionel Barker setting silver dollars on a counter without hesitation, and then carrying her seed to her wagon, and then fixing her windmill, and then teaching her over years that being helped was not the same as being diminished. She had taught him things too. She knew this. She had taught him that his accounts needed to be organized before he could understand his own operation. She had taught him that efficiency and care were not the same quality, and that having both was possible. She had taught him, she thought, though she never said it directly, that a person could have a complicated past and an uncomplicated present, and that the weight of the first need not define the second. On a May evening in 1895, 12 years after the morning that had started everything, Delia sat on the porch with her husband and watched the last of the sun go down behind the western ridge, and listened to the particular quiet of a ranch that was settled for the night, the low, distant sound of cattle, the creak of the windmill on her own property 6 miles east turning in the evening wind. A sound she could not actually hear from this distance but felt she could hear because she knew it was there. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "We should expand the south pasture," she said. "The grass there is underused, and with another 30 head we'd have the numbers to negotiate a better rate per head in San Angelo." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking the same thing for 6 months. She turned to look at him. "Then why haven't you done anything about it?" "Because I was waiting to see how you arrived at it," he said. She stared at him. "That's absurd." "It's not," he said with perfect calm. "You generally see the considerations I've missed. I wanted to see if there was a reason against it that I hadn't thought of yet." She turned back to the evening. She shook her head slowly, and she was smiling. "That is the most practical thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "I married you because you were practical," he said. "You married me because I had backbone," she said. "Both," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "I married you because of both." She felt his hand find hers on the arm of the chair, the same easy certainty with which he had always reached for her, and she held on to it with the same certainty she had always held back. The south pasture was expanded the following spring, and the herd grew, and the numbers in the San Angelo negotiations went the way Delia had predicted, and the east 60 acres produced well in 1896 and better in 1897, and Clara Mee at 14 was genuinely keeping her own section of the farm planting ledger, with a competence that made Jonas shake his head in something between admiration and personal affront at being outpaced by a child. William at 17 was working full alongside his father, a young man who had his mother's dark hair and his father's steadiness, and who had begun, in the last year, to look at a girl named Frances Alderton, whose family had a small spread north of the Cedar Breaks in a way that everyone had noticed, and no one had said anything about yet, though Delia had noticed, and was waiting with the patience she had accumulated over years of watching things develop at their proper rate. She mentioned it to Lionel in the dark one night. "He'll sort himself out," Lionel said. "He will," she agreed. "But it might take him a while. He has your habit of approaching things slowly." "You approach me slowly," he pointed out. "You approach me slowly too," she said. "We're lucky it only took 9 months instead of 3 years." "I was being careful," he said. "I know," she said. "I liked it. I'm saying William might be being careful too, and it might help to know that careful is an acceptable pace." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll talk to him," he said. He must have, because something shifted in William's manner over the following weeks, and by the end of summer, he had ridden over to the Alderton place on a Sunday afternoon with his hat in his hands, and Frances Alderton was not opposed to the visit, and these things have their own momentum once begun. The evening they heard the news of William's engagement in the autumn of 1898, Delia and Lionel were alone on the porch after William had gone to bed, and the night was warm and the stars were out and the country was quiet around them. "We did all right," she said. He turned to look at her in the dark. "With all of it," she said. "The ranch, the farm, the children, the books." She paused. "Each other." He was quiet for a moment. "We did," he said. "There were counterfeit coins," she said, "in the very beginning, and a broken windmill, and books that were a disaster, and $32 that went missing for 9 years. And a woman who rode 6 miles to my ranch to tell me her windmill was broken, which was the best thing that happened to me in a long decade," he said. She looked at him. "You never told me that." "I thought you knew," he said. "Say it again," she said. He turned fully toward her in the evening in the starlight and he said, "You coming to this ranch to ask about that windmill was the best thing that happened to me. You paying back money I didn't need repaid. You showing up every Friday morning, until Friday morning became the center around which the rest of the week organized itself." She felt the familiar warmth of him in his voice, the thing that had always been there, that careful, deliberate tenderness that he did not put on display for anyone but made available to her at every turn. "I brought counterfeit money into Hartwell's store," she said. "You were in an impossible situation and you were doing what you could," he said. "You didn't know those coins were no good." She looked at him steadily. "I suspected. And you went anyway," he said. "Because the field needed planting, and the field is what was going to keep you on your land. I can't fault a person for that. I wouldn't have." She had carried that guilt in a quiet, manageable compartment for 15 years, and it had gotten smaller over time, as guilts do when they are acknowledged rather than suppressed, but it had never entirely gone. Sitting in the dark with him saying what he said, she felt it become something else, not absolution exactly, because she had not asked for that and would not, but a kind of context in which the thing she had done was part of a larger story rather than its defining fact. "I'm glad you were in that store," she said. "I came in for coffee," he said. "I hadn't planned to cover anyone's seed bill." "Life doesn't ask what you planned," she said. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She leaned her head against his shoulder in the dark, something she had done 1,000 times and still found precisely right, the particular solid warmth of him and the steady way he did not shift or adjust, but simply was where she needed him to be. The country around them was vast and dark and alive with small sounds, the crickets and the distant cattle and the windmill turning somewhere in the night. The ranch house was warm behind them, with the children sleeping and the good smell of a day's work settling into the wood, and the stone of a place that had been lived in with care. The books were on the shelf in the office, organized and current and honest, a record of what this life had cost and what it had earned, and neither measure was complete without the other. William would marry Frances and would take over the South Pasture operation and would be good at it. Clara Mee would manage the East 60 with an intensity that would eventually push the operation to 80 acres and would cause the agricultural extension agents to come specifically to study her rotation methods, and she would let them study and not make a fuss about it. Lionel would slow down as the century turned, not because he was old but because he had built something substantial enough to hand down without distress, and he would spend more mornings on the porch with his coffee and more evenings watching the country darken toward night, and he would find this satisfying in the exact proportion that he had worked hard enough to earn it. Delia would not slow down because that was not her nature, but she would shift her attention from the urgent work of building to the more nuanced work of sustaining, and she would discover that sustaining things she loved was not less challenging but differently challenging, which was a distinction she found meaningful. They would grow old together in the way of people who have built a life jointly and are not surprised by the aging because they have had the sense to notice each other at every stage of it. He would continue to bring her coffee without being asked, and she would continue to point out the things he had missed in his accounting and his reasoning, and they would disagree with enough frequency to keep both of them honest and agree with enough frequency to keep both of them at ease. But that was all ahead, in the dark of the future that the stars above Colton's Crossing looked down on without commentary. Tonight on the porch in the autumn of 1898 there was only the present which was full enough. "Do you ever think about who else you might have been?" she asked him. If things had gone differently, he thought about it seriously, which he always did when she asked him a serious thing. "No," he said. "I think I was always going to be here. I think the land chose me as much as I chose it." "And me?" she said. "Did you choose me?" He turned his head to look at her in the dark, and even with the night between them she could see the expression, the clear and steady thing that had not changed in 15 years, the way he looked at her as if she were the most interesting and worthwhile thing in his particular line of sight. "I chose you," he said, "the moment you stood at the counter of Hartwell's store and decided not to flinch." She was quiet for a moment. The stars were very bright. The windmill turned somewhere in the east in the dark, its good clean sound carrying through the night air, a sound that meant water rising and land sustained and something broken made whole. "Good," she said. And they sat together in the good dark of the life they had made, and it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was everything.